People don't care. They want to carry on. Cheap flights, consequences safely tucked out of mind, out of view. We want our pineapples in the winter. Besides, what can we do anyhow? The engines are moving. The wheels of industry press on. Our governments seem paralyzed, stuck in an inertia of global business. And the strong and growing voices of dissent crying, "Go away. We don't want you naysayers ruining my party. Save it for others." Apathy, numbness, dull, disconnected, turned off, switched off. I don't care. Just notice, how does it feel as I say these words in your body, as you kind of let the words wash over you? What does it feel like inside? How often have we experienced apathy, quote, apathy, in ourselves, in our anger as we read the headlines, as we wonder how on earth can we shift public perceptions to climate change threat? I actually want to argue today that, in fact, the concept of apathy is, at its essence, a misnomer. It is destructive, misleading, patronizing. And I also want to suggest that psychoanalysis specifically offers a crucial lens into how chronic ecological threats are experienced, managed, and responded to. And this was also very clearly and beautifully expressed earlier in Rosemary's paper and the comments. In thinking about apathy, and I use a quote here that I found by Freud, I find myself for a moment in the interesting position of not knowing whether what I have to say should be regarded as something long familiar and self-evident, or as something entirely new and puzzling. Freud wrote those words when he was first writing about the concept of the splitting of the ego, and it's exactly how I feel when I speak these words about apathy, because it feels that I'm stating something both extremely familiar and basic, and yet new. We're all familiar, perhaps intimately, with what we call apathy in ourselves, our colleagues, children, communities, government, and yet it does become new territory in the context of contemporary ecological threats. The concept of apathy is pervasive, particularly in environmental sectors and communications. It's seductive and insidious. It appears in public discourses, environmental activism, our own confrontation with what it feels like in ourselves. I think it's important to remember that apathy as a construct was coined in the 40s. It really came into currency around this time. And it was a concept that was designed to basically describe why a public were not responding in the way, in desired ways to public information campaigns. So there's a paper that really is one of the first papers to use this concept when describing public response to a pressing social issue as being apathetic. We do this now, the same thing to people who are not responding to our climate change crisis with the behavior, actions, and feelings we may expect, desire, and need, and we call this apathy. I think it's really important to mention Harold Searles here, who's profoundly inspired my thinking about this topic, and I want to also flag the point that Harold Searles, an American psychoanalyst, was writing about these topics in the 60s and the 70s, and I guess there's a subtext to this question, which is what happened? Why was this not taken up when he was putting this out there in the 60s and the 70s? That's another topic for us to think about. But I want to read this quote by Harold Searles. "My hypothesis is that man is hampered in his meeting of this environmental crisis by severe and pervasive apathy, which is based largely upon feelings and attitudes of which he is unconscious. That lack of analytic literature about this subject suggests to me that we analysts are in the grip of this common apathy." So the problem, as far as I'm concerned, is, one of the problems is that we do tend to focus primarily on behavior. And this is sort of the first thread in sort of unraveling, in my mind, the kind of conventional approach that we are taking to these issues around response to climate change is an overwhelming focus on behavior. So what I want to talk about in the rest of my time is why apathy is problematic and damaging, and specifically what a psychoanalytic engagement means for this work and topic. I'm speaking to you not as a psychoanalyst, but as a psychoanalytically informed researcher and someone who's worked in the environmental communication sector for years. What I'm interested in is reframing how we position the public and the communities we want to support and mobilize. I speak to you as someone who has found a psychoanalytic perspective perhaps the most powerful tool we have for working with issues of resistance, splitting, denial, and the range of other defensive mechanisms widely connected with environmental degradation. So first I want to talk a little bit about what an analytic attitude implies and how I've attempted to bring this attitude and these ideas into my research project. And in order to do that, I'm going to present very briefly a tiny bit of data from my project because I don't have much time to go into it, a case study to help illustrate some of what I'm talking about. And then I'm going to make a sort of a theoretical detour and go into some detail about some of the theoretical ideas that have been particularly important for this project. And that would be Freud on transience, and that really has to do with melancholia. Christopher Bolus on what he calls the transformational object and how that helps us think very creatively about what an environmental object relations theory might look like, and basic concepts, psychoanalytic concepts of reparation. And I conclude with very brief comments about what this all might mean in terms of practice and application, which I think is really sort of the question on all of our minds. How can we service this? What does this do for us in our practice? So first, just a few bits about the analytic attitude. This may be basic for some in the audience, but an analytic attitude brings a sensitivity to these conflicts that may arise. Ivan Ward, who's here today, spoke of this in 1992 at the Ecological Madness event he convened at the Freud Museum, an event not unlike ours today, where he brought together members of the psychoanalytic community with environmental activists to forge a dialogue. I don't know how successful he was in terms of launching an ongoing dialogue, but his comments published in the British Journal of Psychoanalysis suggest there are some tensions regarding what he called and discussed the analytic attitude in environmental activism. So following Ward, I want to first step back and contextualize a bit how psychoanalytic work dovetails with current existing concerns in environmental circles. Generally, there seems to be a recognition that climate change can generate anxiety. And it feels obvious to say this, but it still remains strangely ignored. It seems to also be recognized that there are competing desires with regard to industrial development. It brings pleasure, but also occasions fears. What the majority of the current environmental discourse focuses on is mainly the fear and anxiety aspects, and these are often referred to as barriers to action. While psychoanalysis is new to this particular topic, there are parallel and overlapping discussions that Bob mentioned earlier taking place concerning why guilt and fear-based appeals to action do not seem to be working. However, there's very little understanding, in my view, as to why this is the case. Environmental ethics has also been edging towards this topic. Simon Blackburn wrote in his book on Being Good, "Ethics is disturbing. We are often vaguely uncomfortable when we think of such things as exploitation of the world's resources or the way our comforts are provided by the most miserable labor conditions of the third world. Sometimes, defensively, we get angry when such things are brought up. But to be entrenched in a culture, rather than merely belonging to the occasional rogue, exploitative attitudes will themselves need a story." And this is really the important part. We can ask from a psychoanalytic viewpoint, what does it mean to tell stories that help maintain exploitative attitudes? What are the stories we tell to each other and ourselves? How might defense mechanisms enable or produce certain strategies for such stories? Engaging concepts of unconscious processes, fantasies, and desires, what might we learn about the psychic processes involved when facing the ethics of ecological sustainability, particularly when touching on issues of unpleasure, distress, the reduction of pleasure, or the reminder of limits and boundaries? As Searles, again, sensitively pointed out, to what extent will we defend against the perceived threats to our hard-won Oedipal accomplishments, such as the automobile, the plane, the luxuries provided through wealth and exploitation? Psychoanalytic work tells us that we are able to simultaneously hold conflicting desires, thoughts, and impulses, even those that appear diametrically opposed. This, again, seems completely obvious, but seems to be missing in most environmental psychology research and literature, as far as I can tell. Walt Whitman wrote, "We contain multitudes." And of course, there's the fact that some of these multitudes are more preferred than others, or more tolerable than others. Environmentalists are often the unwanted guests at the dinner party. People don't want to be reminded of the dark side of our pleasures, conditions in which our food was grown, picked, and shipped, our own imbrication and practices that we may, on the face of it, find abhorrent and opposed to our sense of ourselves as good and virtuous people. And yet we are, in hundreds of small and big ways, reminded of our complicity in the destruction of our own home, our planet's ecosystems. How we manage this, cope, process, reflect, and respond is where psychoanalysis can help us recognize the power of unconscious desires, that we may in fact want our cars and cheap flights, and we also want to avoid a global climate-induced catastrophe. Further, we possess both reparative, creative, and destructive capacities. While industrial practices may in fact involve a certain form of splitting in terms of good nature and bad nature, what we know of human history, how we relate with nature, environment, ecology, is far from straightforward. And we must always be contextualized socially, historically, culturally, and politically. Again, not to just take a shot at environmental psychology, but this complexity seems to be consistently glossed over. Humans use nature, and we do produce waste. Yet how environmental psychology and psychology in general tackles these problems consistently presumes a unitary, rational subject, that what you see is what you get. And research is actually a lot easier to conduct that way if you have that orientation. You can base a lot on surveys and polls and questionnaires and focus groups and carry on and get funding. And so, I can appreciate that there's a real practicality to that. But the question is really, what is being missed out? What's being overlooked? And how can we think about a new way of conducting research into these areas that can capture some of that? And that's really what I'm trying to do in my own way, and what I'd like to see taken up more generally. So how I tried to tackle this was through my research project on subjectivity. And I went into this project really thinking about anxiety, and I was particularly interested and inspired by the way that psychoanalysis really positions anxiety as a central feature of human existence. And so, following on Searles, following on all of my reading in psychoanalytic literature, following on reading about Freud, and how we respond with anxiety, I wanted to really see if I could test that out in some sort of an empirical research context. And in fact, it wasn't that easy. And as I'll explain, I really needed to sort of shift my focus a little bit in terms of really attention to anxiety, and maybe looking more at some themes that might coexist with anxiety or underlie anxiety. So how psychoanalytic conceptions of subjectivity can revise our concepts of environmental engagement was made clear to me during the course of my field work, which was based in the Great Lakes region of the United States. I had chosen a particularly degraded area on the edge of the Great Lakes system, which is home to a lot of industry, particularly the paper industry. And at one point, this place where this person's sitting, this is the Fox River, and that's one of the major paper mills, and at one time Green Bay was the largest producer of paper in the entire United States. So that might kind of put things in perspective here in terms of the impact on the environment. I designed a project that was based around in-depth interviews with 10 individuals. My interview approach was based largely on the work of a South African psychoanalyst and researcher, Duncan Cartwright, who has created an approach to what he calls the psychoanalytic research interview as a mode of exploring highly sensitive and possibly charged content. While the region has a reasonably active yet small environmental community, really this area is more known for its football team, which is the Green Bay Packers, and the fact that this river is listed as a Superfund site. So Superfund site in the U.S. means that federal funds have been committed to doing a massive cleanup of toxic contamination, and it's really not something that you want your city to be known for. It's kind of like a shaming type of thing. Let's see, and what was also happening at the time, this is a photograph I took in the Nature Center in Green Bay. What was happening at the time and how I was trying to join this up with environmental communications, which is really where I'm oriented and trying to work towards in this work, is an active campaign that was happening, and this ad was being placed in magazines around the area. And I was, I had nothing to do with the construction or the production of this ad, but I was particularly interested to know if this sort of advert really was effective. I mean, obviously I couldn't really test that using a very small sample, but I wanted to somehow bring in this ad as a sort of a tool in the interviews and to test my own personal hypothesis that this sort of ad is likely to scare people and make people feel deeply anxious, which it did for me. So here's a little bit about my methodology, which I mentioned. I selected 10 people based on a survey. So I designed a web-based survey. It went out to about 300 people in the area. And I picked people who rated themselves in the survey as not particularly engaged. So basically they could rate themselves on a scale from how often do you think about these issues, never, to frequently. And I would go into the middle and try to find people who would say, maybe sometimes, not very often, that sort of thing. And also I included short responses so I could see how they expressed their perceptions of what's happening in the environment. So these are people basically who would appear as apathetic, potentially if polled about their feelings, actions, and attitudes. These are people who very easily, from an environmental perspective, would be crossed off or maybe seen as an area that's very, very hard to reach in terms of engaging with these issues. So what I found over the course of doing my interviews were very complicated, often contradictory accounts containing high affective investments in the region and specific objects, such as the river, beach, dunes, boat, fish, and a capacity for distancing proximity to the threats facing these same objects. In other words, to invoke Whitman again, how the region of Green Bay was articulated was itself a multitude. It was both spoken of affectionately and with disgust, anger, and appreciation. Industry had brought thousands of jobs and made the city prosperous. It also ruined the ecosystems and more recently is putting the entire drinking water supply for thousands into jeopardy. So I began to sense a powerful series of narratives concerning how industrial threats and development are negotiated affectively and largely unconsciously, and in fact had little to do with actual concern or even attitudes that people had about the environment. In fact, there appeared a surplus of affect. Once people got started talking about these issues, they really didn't stop. And I had a sense also that it was the first time they were actually being really closely and sensitively listened to and contained in talking about these issues, which is another topic to discuss around the methodology. So there was a surplus of affect about these topics, yet these individuals kept their investments around the environment private and channeled mainly in intimate practices, from food choices to teaching grandchildren about the value of nature. I'm not also negating the fact that there's a reason, a broader ideological reason and context, as well as social and political and so on, for how people are articulating and negotiating these issues. I'm not suggesting at all that it's really just kind of a psychic internal process that has nothing to do with the social context, but for right now, I'm focusing on the affective piece. So while I was extremely cautious about the risks of conducting wild analysis, wary of bringing psychoanalysis into the field, in fact, I was kind of a nervous wreck the whole time, I found the data powerfully suggestive of complicating issues that can produce difficulties for engaging in reparation. And this is a term that psychoanalysts use for the idea of making repair. Primarily, focusing rather than focusing on anxiety as the main driver for keeping people in denial or disavowing these issues, I was more struck by narratives of loss and a sense of mourning or rested mourning with regard to the places and ways of life and earlier selves that environmental issues seem to evoke. And this really did catch me by surprise. When people spoke of specific sites, such as a river, a beach on the Great Lakes, it was done with a nostalgia as if the place no longer existed. There seemed to be a longing, but at the same time, these places were not affectively active for these people. It seemed that the very objects, and I'm using the word object in the psychoanalytic sense, these significant places in their internal and external reality, often these were indeed threatened by very serious environmental problems. But at the same time, they were held in a static, idealized state, so that they had really ceased to be alive and dynamic for these individuals, which really has some interesting questions to raise around what mobilizes and supports reparation, the desire and the capacity to make repair and to feel concern. So in other words, there was not a lack of concern or worry or care about these environmental issues or about these places at all. But what I was noticing was something really curious about the way in which it was being articulated and the way that these affects were being managed and negotiated. What I noticed in the data is that there were some certain qualities about the narratives that I was getting that was suggesting what might be complicating what we would recognize as a kind of a proactive environmental engagement with people. And I found Freud's essay on transience particularly important and useful for this. And I'm just going to read very briefly this little quote from the essay. "Some time ago, I took a walk through a blossoming summer landscape in the company of a silent friend and a young and already well-known poet. The poet admired the beauty of the nature around us, but it did not delight him. He was disturbed by the idea that all this beauty was bound to fade, that it would vanish through all winter, like all human beauty and everything beautiful and noble. All the things he would otherwise have loved and admired seemed to him to be devalued by the fate of transience for which they were destined." He continues, "We know that such absorption and the susceptibility to decay of all that is beautiful can produce two different impulses in the mind. One of these leads to the painful world weariness of the young poet, the other to revolt against the asserted fact. That is, we can either withdraw effectively from the world or we can deny the prospect of loss, reality." He concludes, "That which is distressing may nonetheless be true, but I disputed the pessimistic poet's view." So Freud is articulating here one of the fundamental aspects of the experience of industrial change and ecological threat, anticipatory mourning and the risk of withdrawing all affect, what can appear as apathy. The vignette speaks to the dilemmas of experiencing and encountering environmental issues, the way our experience of the material world and invested objects can be mediated by the sense of impending loss or change. There's quite a bit more to say on this, and I'm going to skip through it. And I was going to introduce how an environmental objects relations theory can be useful for thinking about these issues. This is really my way of trying to illustrate and support this idea that psychoanalytic work can really add such a rich dimension to how we understand environmental engagement. We don't need all the detail about the object relations theory, but Christopher Bollas in his work on the transformational object, I was able to employ in my research to try to understand how these objects, environmental objects for people, had multiple functions, affectively and practically, which might really help complicate what seemed to be, frankly, paradoxical and puzzling modes of response that we keep finding again and again in our surveys and our polls around what we call the attitude-behavior gap, or the gap between values and action. And really a psychoanalytic point of view would never conceptualize a gap. There is no gap. Really what it is a complication of subjective experiences. It's really much more multidimensional than that. And so in a way, what I think our work is about is really challenging these concepts, or really, I should say, finding creative ways to interface.
You probably got from the introduction that I'm not a psychotherapist, far from it. I'm a biologist and an urban planner. And I just want to tell you briefly where I'm coming from, just anchor you against the comments I'm going to make. I think it's quite important for you to understand that for the first half of my career I was an environmental impact assessor, taking all different disciplines, putting them together in a report and trying to anticipate what a proposed development would do to social and environmental areas that was established in. And later, I spent a lot of time with organizations trying to help them to make better decisions to limit their social and environmental impact. And fairly late in the day, I realized that actually my whole career was about trying to affect pro-social and environmental behavior. And my strategy of choice was facts, well-communicated, well-constructed, evidence-based reports, but they were facts. So imagine my disappointment when I realized something that most of you already know. People don't make decisions based on facts. And a little dispirited by this until I bumped into a few social psychologists and started talking to them. My career took off in a different way. And so this is why I really embrace and welcome Renee's paper. It's yet another example for me personally of a whole discipline that reinvigorates and helps me to do what I've devoted the rest of my career, which is to try to advance and accelerate pro-environmental and pro-social motivation and behavior. I was really, really impressed with the sheer range of different psychoanalytical theory that she brings, most of which I'm afraid I hadn't heard of, but I'm much the better for learning about it through her paper. The single most important and striking point for me, and I don't think she actually used these words, probably just because time didn't allow her to, is that what we may be looking at here in terms of inaction against the threat of environmental degradation is not caring too little, but caring too much. That's quite a revelation for me. I'd never actually come across that idea before. Got me thinking about all kinds of different things. And just to recap on the different tactics that government and fellow travelers have used, we've already heard about the dire warning, and I think collectively agree that doesn't work. Exhortations often used, different mixtures of education and awareness, different imposed solutions have been tried, pricing and choice editing. All of these things work to some degree, but they're never going to tip people into a frame of mind where they are then going to describe themselves as, I'm the kind of person who will always act in favor of the environment. And I think that's the biggest challenge. And so turning briefly to my work, what I'm doing now is I'm mixing effectively behavioral economics and deliberative democracy, the so-called nudge-think axis. Some of you might have come across this. So specifically, I'm going into communities and I'm saying, if you buy better insulation and protect your homes against flooding, I will reward you with fruit and vegetables, free public transport, access to education, garden makeovers to the same value that you spend on your house. Simultaneously setting up green community groups so that that behavior is then reinforced in a sort of norm-based peer emphasis. And so what I'm saying here is, in fact, that we have to accept everything that Renee says in her paper and then park it by saying, we might be able to work with people. Sally and I have talked about this before as well. And it's really important that we understand all of this. But as a policy vehicle, it's really difficult. And maybe what we should do is understand more and more and more about why people don't do things, and then find ways to circumnavigate around that by motivating people to do things for different reasons and then bringing them back to accepting the things that they're not willing to embrace. Okay, so the second half of my comment really is some suggestions on where I think this work could go, Renee's work in particular. First is, I think it'd be helpful to put it into context. Some of you may be familiar with the APA's paper just came out recently on psychology and global climate change. I find it really, really helpful, and there's a little list there about what motivates people and what people do in response to the threat of climate change, threat appraisal, coping appraisal, attribution, motivational processes, and a bit that fits really well with what Renee's doing, affective responses. Things like that help people like me. You probably know all this, but we need people coming from other disciplines need to sort of put it all in a package to understand how all this fits together. The second is to consider implications for collective responses. Now, we touched upon this in the session before, that a lot of what we're talking about, have talked about, and will talk about for the rest of this conference is individual responses and how to deal with individuals. But of course, it's equally, I think, important to deal with how people collectively respond to that, and whether we can get over individual inaction with norm-based pushes, if you like. I wrote a book with an organizational psychologist, and we looked at why Swedes are viewed to be the most sustainable people in the world. Very interesting story about the Swedes. Haven't got time to go into it. And also, I looked at the German response to the Brent Spar threat, I suppose you could call it. You remember Brent Spar when Shell was going to put this platform into the sea, and it was actually the Germans, among everyone else, who actually did most of the boycotts, physically attacked petrol stations, mobilized religious and political backing by far, even though they've got the smallest coastline and the least physical relationship to the sea. And actually, that's the key to that story. Again, I haven't got time to tell it to you, but I know it's tantalizing, isn't it? You want me to go on. But all of those things have overcome, in a cultural and collective way, individual reasons for inaction, and that's why I'm raising this. Third, is just to consider experiential influences. So Renee's sample in a degraded environment in a lakeland setting is fascinating. We need to remember, and the work I do is in inner city areas, mainly deprived areas, that people who live in urban environments will have a very different view and a reaction to what's going on around them than to rural. Income levels are very influential. Local and global responses are different. People who are long-term residents of an area will react differently than someone who's come into an area fairly recently. And all of the things that Renee's talked about are all relevant, but individuals will react within that context in very different ways, and I'd like to see more about that. And finally, I found this theory of reasoned behavior really important, and I've simplified it ridiculously the way I can, because I'm not in the discipline, into 5 main questions, but I'm finding it very helpful, and I've used that in my work, and I'd like to put Renee's work into that and find out more how to do that. And the 5 questions, very briefly, are an individual asks themselves before they act, do I actually understand that there is a problem? Now, that has changed quite a lot. Bob was mentioning some of the Ipsos Mori stuff. Pew's also done some very good work in America. That's all changing. People are very much understanding that there's an issue, but is it so much of a problem that I need to do something about it? Do I care what's going on is the second question. Do I know what to do? I often make a joke, I suppose, in the people I talk to, that we are moving from the dark ages of denial into a golden age of confusion. Now, you understand that more than anybody else, actually, because it's much easier for policy makers to influence the confused, because they're desperate for help. The outcome, of course, is exactly the same as those who are denying, which is nothing happens. The last two are, if I do something, will it work? And then again, finally, most importantly, and you understand this as well, what will people think of me if I do it? And we've had a lot of difficulties recently about people who've put little wind turbines on their houses, or switched their vehicles to biofuels, only to be laughed at, ridiculed, and otherwise put in their place by making the wrong decisions. And you know more than me that those sort of influences are absolute stultifying in terms of people's behavior, unless you start to get people to mobilize and talk to each other in a deliberative way. And that's why I think this combination of behavioral economics, deliberative democracy, with an understanding that Renee's put across today, is really, really valuable. And I think that's the way forward. Thank you.
I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to think about her paper and also about Erik's discussion, as well as the discussion earlier today. And I'm basically in agreement with her very convincing argument that apathy may well be a defense against the sensation of pain or distress relating to helplessness and vulnerability. Now, in the paper, she spoke about the disowning of responsibility. And I thought this kind of disowning was so well expressed in Samuel Beckett's play, Not I, where you just see a mouth following the death of a baby, and I think it's very apposite to what's happening to our planet, and you only see a mouth recalling the event and reiterating in the title of the play, Not I. That is, it's not I who will feel the loss, nor I who will bear the guilt. Now, Renee draws our attention to the views of Christopher Bolas that things and events have psychic resonance, and what more so than nature, Mother Earth, onto which perhaps in different ways people may transfer both our earliest love and appreciation of the beauty and nourishment provided by the good mother, as well as our, notably in the modern Western world, destructive rapaciousness. Freud spoke of His Majesty the Baby, and Klein, and later also Hannah Siegel, have stressed how, in their view, the infant is governed by a wish to have it all and be it all. And Klein, in rather graphic language, which felt very shocking at the time in the 30s, speaks of the infant's unconscious fantasy of an inexhaustible breast, the infant's wish to totally possess not only the breast, but the mother's whole body, to scoop out the contents, attack all her other babies, and so on. And I'm not sure at all that the links to the body of the earth and its degradation were made at that time, but they seem very appropriate. But of course, Mother Nature, as well as being even sentimentally equated with all that is good, also represents violent forces, floods, storms, earthquakes, droughts, in keeping, I think, with the infant's fantasies of his own nature and also his fears of retribution or even primitive parental violence. And just as we now think about what comes from the baby and what comes at the baby, we may want to think about what humans do to so-called nature, but also what nature does to humans. And so we may experience global warming as the work, really, of a kind of retributive, punitive superego. Now, in the course of healthy personal development, the child's growing concern for the mother and her other babies is supported by the father, and the infant gradually modifies his demanding behavior, becomes more civilized, but always only up to a point. And I think psychoanalysts agree that these primitive wishes then are never entirely given up. And I think one way of gratifying them would be to split them off and project them into others, and then vicariously identify with characters who are indeed endowed with being able to have it all and be it all. And the adulation of the royal family, Hollywood stars, footballers, and other celebrities, and our wish to emulate them, I think is known to us all. So we split off and distance ourselves from our own rapaciousness, such that it's then British Petroleum or Walmart who exploit the third world and the earth itself, not the responsibility of an I, as let's say a middle-class, car-owning, holiday-going, cheap flight-seeking individual who wants cheap food, petrol, clothing, and so on. And indeed not I, who does not want to have to give anything up. Yet there are situations where we do willingly give things up, in times of war or for our loved ones, and perhaps we need to give more thought to the particular circumstances which mitigate for or against this. But I'm struck, though, looking at a younger generation, some of whom may feel very strongly about the dangers of global warming, yet may in our culture be part of a group where they absolutely must have the latest fashions, the most up-to-date technology, and so on. So I think there's a question, how do our psyches and the times we live in interact? When I arrived in London in 1955, we didn't have, nor did we expect to have, central heating, washing machines, dishwashers, all of which now are considered essential. And once we have them, it's very difficult to give them up. So as Renee says in her paper, very many of us want our cheap flights and want to prevent global catastrophe. We also want all our wants satisfied and want to be morally self-righteous, I think, about the greed of others too. Perhaps like our patients who both want and don't want insight, want to change and want to be able to maintain the status quo. Like that famous quotation, God make me virtuous, but not yet. Now, Winnicott famously said that the first duty of the analyst mother is to survive. And it becomes intensely anxiety-provoking, I think, when we're faced with a picture of a damaged Mother Earth or her babies, even in faraway places, animals threatened with extinction, massive groups of people wiped out by floods, and so on. And I think these sites provoke such anxiety not only because of the current reality, about which we may indeed feel guilt, but also, I think, because it touches off our earliest guilt about damage we've done much closer to home, to our earliest and most essential, indeed, life-giving relationships. So I think at a primitive level, then, we feel threatened not only by the external catastrophes which may befall us, but the catastrophe of retribution from a primitive superego which makes us feel, as Renee says, so vulnerable and helpless, and so persecuted by guilt that we can only turn a blind eye. So I do wonder what would be the relevance for politics of the problems we think about in analysis. Namely, how does the infant make the move from this kind of primitive place to a place where they begin to think more realistically and take responsibility for destructiveness? And I think this is the question everybody's concerned about. And it seems to me, if we think about infant development, I mean, the capacity to make this move is so much related to the presence of a good, realistic parental couple who share responsibility, support him to take responsibility for the damage done, bear guilt for what can't be done, and so on. And I suppose one wonders, what would a government able to, closer to this model look like? Now, I know work has already been done thinking about the link between the psychic and the political. And when we feel vulnerable and helpless, we do depend on realistic parental leadership. But the question I want to ask is, why is this so hard to come by? There's all the talk about Copenhagen, for instance. And so often it seems to me that leadership, even that which starts out by presenting itself as concerned for others, say the church or the Communist Party, so quickly becomes corrupted. The leaders, while preaching moral self-righteousness, become again the ones who have to have it all and be it all. A member of Mugabe's tribe once explained to us that Mugabe was not to be criticized because in tribal culture, the chief is entitled to have it all. So the very motivational processes of leaders to repair seems to revert back to infantile rapaciousness. Closer to home, we only have to think Tony Blair. So I return to my earlier point. Do we at some level put or keep in place leaders, whether by heredity or democratic process, who are appointed or elected, whatever may be the conscious rationale, also to carry both our unacknowledged moral self-righteousness and our greed? And because they carry split-off, unacknowledged parts of ourselves, we're excessively vulnerable to their machinations, helpless to deal with their excesses. And so one can only hope that facing some truths about ourselves may strengthen our capacity to think about and deal with these very complex problems. And I think the more we avoid facing the conflict, the more we're at the mercy of relentlessness, which makes human understanding worthless.